You need to grab your bucket and your rags and get off these steps immediately." The words cut through the howling wind at Teterboro Airport like a blade sharp with authority and dripping with contempt. Captain Derek Harrison stood blocking the aircraft door. His pristine Navy uniform a stark contrast against the storm-darkened sky, his aviator sunglasses reflecting the woman below him despite the fact that rain was hammering the tarmac like bullets from heaven. Dr. Adrienne Maxwell stood at the bottom of the air stairs, water streaming from her faded Howard University sweatshirt, her worn jeans already soaked through. The rain didn't just fall at Teterboro. It attacked with the fury of nature unleashed, turning the exclusive private aviation terminal into a battlefield where only the wealthy were supposed to survive. But Adrienne wasn't moving. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't even surprised. She simply reached into her pocket with the calm precision that had saved countless lives in operating rooms across the country, her dark eyes never leaving the face of the man who had just made the most expensive mistake of his career. "Captain," she said, her voice cutting through the roar of jet engines and storm winds with surgical precision. "You just made a decision that's going to cost you everything you think you own. And the funny thing is, you're standing in front of my front door." The rain at Teterboro wasn't just weather, it was an event. A biblical downpour that turned the playground of Wall Street titans and Hollywood royalty into a watercolor painting of slate and steel, where private jets lined up nose to tail like gleaming white sharks waiting to devour the sky. This wasn't JFK or Newark with their chaos and crowds. This was the sanctuary where the ultra-wealthy came to escape the masses, where a single flight could cost more than most people made in a year. Inside the VIP lounge of Signature Aviation, the air should have smelled of expensive espresso and leather polish. But Dr. Adrienne Maxwell wasn't inside sipping champagne and complaining about the weather delay. She was stuck in the back of a black Uber SUV, not a limousine or a Bentley, just a standard rideshare vehicle trapped in traffic outside the perimeter fence like a commoner begging for entrance to the palace. Adrienne checked her watch, a battered vintage Casio that she wore instead of the Patek Philippe that sat in her jewelry box at home collecting dust like most of the expensive gifts she bought herself but never had time to enjoy. The Casio had been with her through medical school, through residency, through the countless nights when she'd fought death in emergency rooms and won more often than she'd lost. 2:15 p.m. She was late, which bothered her more than the rain or the traffic or the fact that she was probably the only billionaire in New Jersey currently sitting in an Uber. Punctuality was respect, and even though she owned the plane, the crew deserved better than a boss who kept them waiting. "I'm sorry about the hold-up," Doc said. David, her driver, a kind man in his 50s, who had been picking her up from the hospital for 6 months and still couldn't quite believe that the woman in the back seat who always tipped him $50 was one of the richest people in America. "GPS says another 5 minutes, but you know how these places are about letting regular folks through. It's fine," David Adrienne said, adjusting the hood of her oversized sweatshirt. The Howard University logo was faded from countless washes, a reminder of the HBCU that had shaped her before she'd conquered predominantly white institutions across the medical field. She wasn't dressed for a board meeting or a charity gala. She was dressed for comfort, for the simple human pleasure of existing without performance. After a grueling 80-hour week at Johns Hopkins, where she served as chief of neurosurgery while quietly being the primary shareholder of the biotech firm that was revolutionizing brain cancer treatment, all she wanted was to fly to her cabin in Aspen, drink hot tea by the fireplace, and sleep for 2 days straight without anyone needing her to save their life. Adrienne was 42 with skin the color of rich mahogany, and eyes that had seen too much trauma in operating rooms and hospital corridors to be easily rattled by anything the world could throw at her. But today, she wasn't Dr. Maxwell, the miracle worker, the woman whose surgical innovations had saved thousands of lives and whose patents had made her wealthy beyond imagination. Today, she was just Adrienne wearing no makeup, her natural hair pulled back in a simple bun, sweatpants that had holes in the knees, and a pair of sneakers that had walked the halls of more hospitals than most doctors saw in a lifetime. When the car finally pulled up to the tarmac gate, Adrian could see the security guard's hesitation through the rain-streaked windshield. He looked at the Uber, then at her in the back seat, then back at the Uber, his confusion written across his face like a billboard announcing that something didn't add up in his carefully ordered world of private jets and people who belonged to that world. He didn't see the billionaire innovator who had just sold 3 patents for $400 million. He didn't see the woman who had been featured on the cover of Forbes and Time magazine. He saw a tired black woman in a hoodie sitting in the back of a rideshare vehicle, and his brain simply couldn't compute that she might be anything other than what his assumptions told him she was. "Name," the guard asked, leaning out of his booth with the kind of skeptical tone usually reserved for teenagers trying to buy alcohol with fake IDs. "Adrian Maxwell," she said patiently, reciting the tail number that was painted on the side of her $65 million Gulfstream G700. N924AM. The AM stood for Adrian Maxwell, a small vanity she'd allowed herself when she'd bought the jet 6 months ago, upgrading from a smaller aircraft to accommodate the family trips she kept planning but never seemed to take because someone always needed emergency surgery or a medical breakthrough required her immediate attention. The guard typed slowly, frowning at his screen like it was lying to him, checking her ID against her face 3 times, as if she might transform into someone else if he looked long enough. "You're the passenger?" he asked, the disbelief in his voice as obvious as the rain drumming on the roof of his booth. "I am, Adrian," said her voice, carrying the patience that came from decades of dealing with people who couldn't quite believe that she belonged in the rooms where she'd earned her place through brilliance and determination. "Right, go ahead," he said, waving them through, but his expression lingered on skepticism like a bad aftertaste. He likely assumed she was domestic staff, maybe a nanny or personal assistant sent ahead to prepare the cabin for the real passenger, because in his experience, people who looked like Adrian Maxwell didn't own the kinds of aircraft that required security clearances and generated more wealth in fuel costs than most people saw in years. Captain Derek Harrison stood beneath the wing of the massive Gulfstream G700, checking the landing gear with the obsessive attention to detail that had kept him employed in private aviation for 15 years. He looked like he had been manufactured in a factory designed to build the perfect pilot square-jaw silver fox hair, perfectly styled despite the rain-crisp navy uniform with 4 gold stripes on the epaulettes and aviator sunglasses that he wore even in storms because image was everything in this business. Derek had flown for Saudi princes who treated jets like flying palaces, Russian oligarchs who conducted business at 40,000 feet, and tech billionaires who thought money could buy them immunity from physics. He prided himself on maintaining what he called standards, though those standards had more to do with his personal comfort zone than actual safety or service excellence. To Derek Harrison, private aviation was the last sanctuary of proper order in a world gone mad with political correctness and social media outrage. He despised the new money crowd, the rappers and influencers who treated $100 million aircraft like party buses, leaving behind champagne stains and Instagram props. But more than anything, Derek hated disorder, hated when reality didn't match his expectations of how the wealthy should look, speak, and behave. What nobody knew, including his crew, was that Derek Harrison was drowning in debt so deep that every breath felt like water filling his lungs. His daughter Emma, barely 16 and fighting a rare form of bone cancer, needed experimental treatments that insurance companies called investigational and refused to cover. The bills were crushing him like an avalanche, $20,000 a month for medications that might give his little girl a chance to see her 18th birthday. That financial desperation had led him down a path he'd never imagined walking. 3 years ago, when the medical bills first started arriving like death sentences written in numbers, a contact at the aviation company had approached him with a simple proposition. carry some extra cargo, ask no questions, and earn enough money to save his daughter's life. The cargo was always the same high-value items that wealthy clients wanted to transport without the scrutiny of commercial customs. Watches, jewelry, art pieces, things that represented more money than Derek had ever seen, but seemed so small and harmless when packed in discreet cases. He told himself it was just rich people avoiding taxes. Nothing that really hurt anyone, certainly nothing worth his daughter's life. But the operation had grown larger and more complex, and Derek had found himself trapped in a web of criminal enterprise that he couldn't escape without losing everything. The men who ran this network didn't accept resignation letters. They accepted results, and Derek Harrison had become very good at delivering those results while maintaining the perfect facade of a professional pilot. His co-pilot, Tyler Chen, was 28 years old, and everything Derek had once been before the world had beaten him down with medical bills and impossible choices. Tyler was idealistic, recently married to his college sweetheart, and still believed that hard work and integrity were enough to build a good life. Derek envied him that innocence while simultaneously resenting it, knowing that life had a way of teaching lessons that could break even the strongest people. The flight attendant, Maya Rodriguez, was a single mother of two who needed this job more than she needed to speak up about the patterns she'd noticed in Derek's behavior over the past year. She'd seen him treat non-white passengers differently, watched him make assumptions based on appearances, heard him make comments that made her stomach turn. But Maya had rent to pay and children to feed, and jobs in private aviation were hard to come by for people who didn't have connections or trust funds. Derek checked his watch as the storm intensified around them. 2:25 p.m. The owner was late, which annoyed him more than it should have. In his world, punctuality was a sign of respect, and wealthy people who couldn't be bothered to show up on time for their own flights were everything wrong with society. He'd been told the passenger was a Dr. A. Maxwell, a VIP, who deserved special attention, but the manifest didn't include a photo or detailed information. First flight with the new owner, and she's already late. Derek muttered to Tyler, who was conducting his own pre-flight inspection on the opposite side of the aircraft. These people have no respect for schedules, no understanding that keeping a crew waiting costs money and wastes everyone's time. Tyler shrugged, more focused on the magnificent aircraft than on his captain's complaints. The G700 was a masterpiece of engineering and luxury with a range that could take them anywhere in the world and amenities that rivaled five-star hotels. He felt privileged just to be part of the crew that got to fly such an incredible machine. Maybe there's traffic, Tyler suggested, his voice carrying the optimism that Derek found increasingly grating. Weather's pretty bad out there. Traffic is for people who don't own helicopters. Derek scoffed, wiping rain from his glasses with practiced irritation. When you own a jet like this, you take a helicopter to the tarmac. You don't make the crew stand in the rain wondering if you're actually going to show up. Derek saw the black SUV approaching through the downpour, and his lip curled when he realized it wasn't a Rolls-Royce or Bentley, just a generic rideshare vehicle, the kind of transportation that had no business on a private aviation tarmac. His assumptions kicked into high gear, processing the visual information through the filter of his prejudices and coming up with answers that felt comfortable and familiar. "Look at this," he groaned, gesturing toward the approaching vehicle. "Probably maintenance or catering. I told dispatch we're not a cargo service. We're flying a VIP, not running deliveries for the ground crew." The car stopped, and Derek watched as a figure in a gray hoodie stepped out into the rain. He saw the worn sneakers, the casual clothes, the relaxed posture of someone who clearly didn't understand the gravity of walking onto a tarmac where $65 million worth of aircraft sat waiting. In Derek Harrison's carefully constructed worldview, people who looked like Dr. Adrienne Maxwell entered airports through employee entrances, usually carrying cleaning supplies or catering trays. He stepped out from under the protective wing of the aircraft, moving with the purposeful stride of a man who had spent 15 years believing that his uniform gave him authority over anyone who didn't wear one. The rain immediately soaked through his jacket, but Derek's pride was stronger than his comfort. He had a standard to maintain, an order to preserve, and he'd be damned if he was going to let some confused ground worker clutter up his perfectly organized pre-flight routine. As Adrienne Maxwell walked toward the stairs of her own aircraft, Derek Harrison prepared to make the biggest mistake of his career, completely unaware that the woman approaching him could buy and sell his entire life with the change in her checking account, and that his next words would set in motion a series of events that would destroy everything he thought he'd built while revealing truths he'd spent years trying to hide. The rain intensified as Adrienne stepped onto the tarmac, each droplet hitting the asphalt like tiny explosions that sent up clouds of mist and spray. The smell of jet fuel mixed with wet concrete created an industrial perfume that spoke of power and money, of dreams that could be bought for the right price, and ambitions that soared as high as the aircraft that surrounded them. Teterboro at this moment felt like a stage set for confrontation, with dramatic lighting provided by storm clouds and lightning sound effects, courtesy of thunder and engine noise, and an audience of ground crew and passengers who sensed that something significant was about to unfold in front of them. Adrienne grabbed her duffel bag from the Uber's trunk, the same battered bag that had carried her through medical school, through residency, through the countless nights when she'd slept in hospital call rooms and dreamed of the day when she could help people without worrying about insurance companies and hospital politics. The bag was worn and practical, showing its age, like a faithful companion that had been through wars and victories. She thanked David, her driver, with genuine warmth, slipping him a $50 bill despite the fact that she could have bought his entire car without checking her bank balance. Adrienne had never forgotten what it felt like to count every dollar, to choose between textbooks and groceries, to wonder if her dreams were bigger than her bank account could support. As she slung the bag over her shoulder and began walking toward the stairs of her jet, Adrienne felt the familiar sensation of being watched and judged. It was the same feeling she'd experienced in medical conferences where she was the only black woman in rooms full of white men, the same energy that followed her through hospital corridors where patients sometimes asked if the real doctor was coming to see them. But she'd learned long ago that other people's assumptions were their problem, not hers. She had work to do, places to be, and a cabin in Aspen calling her name with promises of peace and solitude that felt increasingly precious as her professional responsibilities multiplied. Derek Harrison watched her approach with the focused attention of a security guard who'd spotted a potential threat. In his mind, he was protecting the aircraft and maintaining the standards that separated private aviation from the chaos of commercial travel. He saw the sneakers, the hoodie, the casual confidence of someone who clearly didn't understand that she was trespassing in a world where appearances mattered and protocol was everything. Tyler Chen continued his pre-flight inspection on the far side of the aircraft, but he could sense tension building in the air like the electrical charge that preceded lightning strikes. He'd worked with Derek long enough to recognize the signs of his captain's agitation, the way Derek's shoulders squared and his jaw tightened when he felt his authority was being challenged or his carefully ordered world was being disrupted. Maya Rodriguez watched from the cabin doorway, her experienced flight attendant. Instincts telling her that the approaching storm had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the collision of assumptions and reality that was about to play out on the tarmac below her. She'd seen this dynamic before, had watched Derek make judgments about passengers based on their appearance, and she felt her stomach tighten with the familiar knot of knowing that something bad was about to happen while feeling powerless to prevent it. Other ground crew members were beginning to notice the tableau unfolding near the G700. Mechanics paused in their work, baggage handlers slowed their pace, and passengers boarding nearby aircraft found their attention drawn to the confrontation that seemed to be building like pressure in a boiler. Some discreetly pulled out phones, sensing that they might be witnessing something worth recording. The wealthy passengers and crew members on adjacent aircraft represented a cross-section of America's elite tech executives, entertainment industry moguls, financial titans, and their families. They lived in a world where private jets were as common as taxis, where million-dollar flights were routine business expenses, where the very wealthy rarely encountered the kind of assumptions and prejudices that shaped the daily experience of people who looked different from them. But they were about to witness a masterclass in how unconscious bias operated even in the rarefied air of private aviation, how someone's preconceptions could blind them to reality so completely that they would block a woman from boarding her own $65 million aircraft simply because she didn't look like what they expected wealth to look like. Adrienne reached the bottom of the air stairs and paused for a moment, looking up at her beautiful jet. The G700 represented freedom to her, the ability to travel anywhere in the world without depending on commercial airlines or dealing with the hassles of TSA lines and delayed flights. It was also a symbol of how far she'd come from the girl who had grown up in a neighborhood where private jets were things you saw in movies, not things you owned. She'd bought the aircraft as a gift to herself after her latest patent sale, a breakthrough in neurosurgical techniques that was already saving lives in hospitals around the world. The money meant security, the ability to fund her research without begging for grants, the power to help other young scientists and doctors who looked like her and needed someone to believe in their potential. But more than that, the jet represented the simple human desire to go where she wanted when she wanted without having to explain herself to anyone or prove that she belonged in spaces where wealth was the only credential that mattered. She'd worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let anyone make her feel like she didn't deserve the rewards of her success. Derek stepped into her path with the authority of a man who believed his uniform gave him the right to control who could access the aircraft behind him. He planted himself at the bottom of the stairs, like a human barrier, his body language broadcasting dominance and dismissal in equal measure. The confrontation was now inevitable, set in motion by assumptions that ran deeper than conscious thought, by biases that operated below the surface of awareness, by the collision of Derek's need for order and control with Adrienne's simple desire to board her own plane and fly home. Around them, the storm continued to build, lightning illuminating the tarmac in stark white flashes that made the scene look like a photograph negative black and white with no room for the gray areas that existed between perception and reality, between what people assumed and what was actually true. The next few minutes would change everything for everyone involved, turning a routine flight into a viral moment, transforming lives and careers, and proving that sometimes the most expensive lessons are the ones we teach ourselves through our own prejudices and failures to see the humanity in other people. "Hey, Derek," shouted over the wind, his voice carrying the kind of authoritative bark that he'd perfected during 15 years of dealing with what he considered unruly ground crew and maintenance workers. "You're at the wrong aircraft." Adrienne didn't stop immediately. She continued walking toward the stairs with the measured pace of someone who had every right to be exactly where she was, shielding her eyes from the rain with one hand while maintaining her grip on the duffel bag with the other. The wind whipped around the massive aircraft, creating a tunnel effect that made conversation difficult and added an element of chaos to what should have been a routine boarding process. "Excuse me," she called back, her voice carrying clearly despite the storm. There was no anger in her tone, no defensiveness, just the mild curiosity of someone who hadn't quite understood what had been said to her. "I said you're at the wrong plane," Derek repeated, stepping closer and raising his voice to ensure she could hear him over the weather. His aviator sunglasses reflected the gray sky and lightning flashes, making his expression unreadable, but his body language unmistakably hostile. "Maintenance and cleaning for the NetJets fleet is over at Hangar 4. This is a privately owned aircraft, and you can't be walking around here without proper authorization." The words hung in the air between them like poisonous gas, heavy with assumptions and dripping with condescension. Derek had made his judgment in the space of a heartbeat, processing visual information through filters built from years of unconscious bias and arriving at conclusions that felt natural and obvious to him. Adrienne stopped 3 feet from the bottom of the stairs, close enough to see her own reflection in Derek's sunglasses, close enough to notice the way his jaw was clenched and his shoulders squared in a posture of defensive aggression. The rain was beginning to soak through her sweatshirt, cold water trickling down her back and making her acutely aware of how exposed she was on the open tarmac. "I'm not maintenance," she said calmly, her voice carrying the same controlled tone she used when dealing with difficult colleagues in medical settings. "I'm here for this flight." Derek laughed, and it wasn't a pleasant sound. It was the kind of sharp, dismissive bark that people used when they encountered something so far outside their expectations that humor was the only way their brain could process it. He looked over at Tyler, who was now watching the interaction with growing discomfort, and shook his head as if sharing a private joke about the absurdity of the situation. "Listen, sweetheart," Derek said, the condescension in his voice so thick you could practically see it hanging in the humid air. The term of address was calculated to diminish and dismiss to establish a hierarchy where he held all the power and she held none. "I don't know who sent you out here. Maybe catering needed a runner or someone from ground services got confused, but the owner of this aircraft is due to arrive any minute now." He gestured toward her duffel bag with a dismissive wave. "If that's catering supplies, you can hand them to me and I'll make sure they get loaded properly. If it's not, then you need to turn around and find whoever you're supposed to be working for, because this is a restricted area, and I don't want you cluttering up the stairs when our VIP passenger arrives." The assumptions embedded in Derek's words revealed the entire architecture of his worldview. Black woman plus casual clothes plus humble transportation equals service worker. It was a mental equation so automatic that he didn't even recognize it as prejudice. Just common sense based on his experience of how the world was supposed to work. Around them, other people were beginning to take notice of the confrontation unfolding near the G700. A mechanic working on a nearby bombardier had stopped what he was doing and was watching with obvious interest. Ground crew members were slowing their pace as they moved between aircraft, sensing drama in the way that people always seem to know when human conflict was about to boil over into something memorable. Passengers boarding other jets were looking out their windows, some pulling out phones to record what was beginning to look like a confrontation worth documenting. In the age of social media, everyone was a potential witness to viral moments, and something about the body language of the two people facing off near the stairs suggested that this was going to be one of those encounters that people would be talking about for a long time. Maya Rodriguez leaned out of the cabin doorway, her experienced flight attendant instincts telling her that this was going to go badly for everyone involved. She could see the tension in Derek's shoulders, could recognize the signs of his building agitation, and she knew from experience that when Derek got defensive, he also got aggressive. She'd watched him handle difficult passengers before, and it never ended well for anyone who challenged his authority or made him feel like his control was slipping. Tyler Chen was now openly staring at the confrontation, his pre-flight inspection forgotten as he tried to make sense of what he was witnessing. Something felt wrong about the entire situation, but he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him. The woman didn't look like maintenance or catering staff, didn't have the hurried demeanor of someone who was lost or confused, didn't seem intimidated by Derek's aggressive posture or authoritative tone. Adrian took a deep breath, drawing on decades of experience dealing with people who underestimated her capabilities based on her appearance. She'd encountered this dynamic in hospitals, where patients assumed she was a nurse in conferences, where colleagues assumed she was someone's assistant in restaurants, where servers assumed she couldn't afford the wine list. Each encounter had taught her something about patience, about strategic responses, about choosing battles carefully. "Captain Sterling," she said, reading the name tag on Derek's uniform jacket. "My name is Adrian Maxwell, and I am the passenger you're waiting for." The statement was delivered with the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she was worth. But Derek's brain simply couldn't process information that contradicted his assumptions so completely. The cognitive dissonance was too extreme, the gap between expectation and reality too wide for him to bridge in the span of a few seconds. Derek looked her up and down with theatrical skepticism, taking in every detail of her appearance as if he were conducting a formal inspection. The hoodie, The worn jeans, the sneakers that had clearly seen better days, the duffel bag that looked like military surplus rather than designer luggage. None of it matched his mental image of what a VIP passenger should look like, especially not someone wealthy enough to own a $65 million aircraft. "You," he said, pointing a gloved finger at her sweatshirt. "You're telling me that you're the owner of this aircraft dressed like that?" The question contained layers of meaning that went far beyond clothing choices. It was about who belonged in spaces of extreme wealth, about what success was supposed to look like, about the assumptions people made when they saw someone who didn't fit their narrow definitions of power and prosperity. "Is there a dress code for owning a plane?" Captain Adrian asked, her voice hardening slightly as the rain continued to soak through her clothes. The question was deceptively simple, but it cut to the heart of Derek's assumptions and challenged the entire framework he'd used to judge her worthiness to be in this space. "There's a standard of conduct." Derek snapped, his defensiveness now in full bloom. "And I know what's on the flight manifest. We're scheduled to fly Dr. A. Maxwell, a VIP client, not..." He waved his hand vaguely in her direction, the gesture encompassing everything about her that didn't match his expectations. "I am Dr. Maxwell," Adrian stated firmly, her patience beginning to wear thin as cold rainwater trickled down her spine, and the absurdity of the situation started to outweigh her natural inclination toward diplomacy. "Sure you are," Derek sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm and disbelief. "And I'm the King of England. Now step back before I call security and have you removed from this restricted area for trespassing and harassment of the flight crew." The threat hung in the air like a thunderclap, final and absolute in Derek's mind, but completely hollow to anyone who understood the true dynamics of the situation. Around them, the storm continued to build, but the real tempest was just beginning to form in the space between a woman who knew exactly who she was and a man who thought he knew exactly who she couldn't possibly be. The wind picked up, dramatically whipping rain against the side of the aircraft with such force that it sounded like machine gun fire against the aluminum fuselage. Derek Harrison stood his ground at the bottom of the stairs, his uniform jacket now soaked through, but his determination to maintain what he saw as proper order only growing stronger with each drop of cold water that hit his face. Tyler Chen walked over from the other side of the aircraft, his nervousness evident in the way he kept glancing between Derek and Adrian, sensing that something fundamental was wrong with this entire interaction, but not quite sure how to intervene without undermining his captain's authority. Tyler had worked with Derek for 8 months, long enough to recognize the signs of his building agitation, the way Derek's voice got sharper when he felt challenged, and his body language became more aggressive when his assumptions were questioned. Derek, Tyler said quietly, stepping close enough to be heard over the storm, but trying to keep his voice low enough that the woman couldn't hear him. "Maybe we should just check the manifest again, or ask to see some identification. Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation." Derek turned toward his co-pilot with the kind of withering look he usually reserved for ground crew who questioned his instructions or passengers who complained about turbulence. "I don't need to check anything to recognize a security risk when I see one." "Tyler," he said, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man whose authority was being questioned by multiple people simultaneously. "Teterboro security has been getting lax lately. People have been sneaking onto the tarmac to take selfies with the aircraft, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let some confused maintenance worker complicate our departure." Maya Rodriguez had moved from the cabin doorway to the top of the stairs, close enough to hear the entire conversation, but high enough to have a better view of the scene unfolding below her. She could see other ground crew members gathering at a respectful distance, could see passengers in nearby aircraft pressing their faces to windows, could see people discreetly pulling out phones to record what was beginning to look like a confrontation that might end up on social media within the hour. Maya had seen Derek interact with passengers before, had watched him be charming and professional with wealthy white clients while becoming dismissive and condescending with anyone who didn't fit his narrow definition of what success should look like. She'd bitten her tongue through countless interactions where Derek's unconscious bias had created uncomfortable situations. But this felt different, more charged, more dangerous to everyone involved. Derek took a step down the stairs, using his height advantage and the symbolic power of his uniform to loom over Adrian in a display of physical intimidation that was calculated to make her back down and retreat. He was a big man over 6 feet tall with the broad shoulders of someone who had played football in college, and he knew how to use his physical presence as a tool of control and dominance. "Let me make this crystal clear," Derek said, his voice dropping to the kind of low, dangerous tone that people used when they wanted to sound threatening without technically making threats. "This is a restricted area. You are trespassing on private property. I don't care if you're lost, confused, or trying to hustle your way onto an aircraft that you can't afford to charter, but you need to get away from my aircraft right now." The possessive pronoun was telling, revealing how Derek thought about his role and his relationship to the machinery he flew. In his mind, the aircraft became his domain the moment he signed the flight manifest, and anyone who challenged his authority within that domain was challenging something fundamental about his identity and professional competence. Adrienne's grip on her duffel bag tightened until her knuckles stood out against her dark skin like mountain peaks. She had been patient, had tried to de-escalate the situation through calm explanation and professional courtesy. But Derek's escalating aggression was pushing her toward a response that would demonstrate exactly how much power she actually wielded in this situation. "Your aircraft," she repeated softly, her voice carrying a dangerous quiet that people who knew her well would have recognized as a warning sign. It was the same tone she used in operating rooms when someone questioned her surgical decisions or suggested that she might not be capable of handling a complex procedure. Derek nodded with the satisfied confidence of a man who believed he had established his dominance and made his position clear. "I am the captain of this aircraft," he declared, puffing out his chest and straightening his shoulders to emphasize his authority. "While we're on this tarmac, my word is law, and I am ordering you to leave this area immediately before I have security escort you off the property." Around them, the audience of witnesses was growing larger and more interested. A couple boarding a nearby Learjet had stopped halfway up their own stairs to watch the drama unfolding 50 yards away. Ground crew members were finding reasons to work closer to the G700, drawn by the same instinct that made people slow down to look at car accidents. The maintenance worker who had been watching from the beginning was now openly staring his work forgotten in favor of the human theater playing out in front of him. Adrian pulled her phone from her pocket, with deliberate slowness, the movement so controlled and purposeful that it commanded attention from everyone watching. Her fingers didn't tremble as she unlocked the device, didn't hurry as she scrolled through her contacts, didn't show any of the nervousness or intimidation that Derek was expecting to see. "I'm going to make a phone call. Captain Harrison," she said, her voice carrying the kind of absolute calm that preceded either complete surrender or total warfare. "And when I finish this call, you're going to wish you had simply asked to see my identification, instead of assuming you knew who I was based on what I was wearing." Derek crossed his arms over his chest and smirked the expression of a man who was certain he was about to watch someone embarrass themselves through an obvious bluff. "Go ahead," he said with theatrical bravado. "Call your supervisor. Call the cleaning company. Call whoever you want and tell them that Captain Derek Harrison prevented you from trespassing on a $65 million aircraft because you were too confused to find the right hangar." But Adrian wasn't calling a cleaning company or a supervisor or anyone else that Derek's assumptions suggested she might know. She was scrolling to a contact labeled Jonathan Pierce, CEO, the man who ran the aviation management company that had staffed Derek's flight and who had personally assured her that her new aircraft would be crewed by the most professional pilots in the industry. Tyler's unease was now approaching full-scale alarm as he watched the confidence in Adrian's posture and listened to the certainty in her voice. Something about her demeanor, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of Derek's aggression, suggested that she wasn't just some confused ground worker who had wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. Derek Tyler whispered urgently, stepping closer to his captain. "She's not acting like someone who's lost or confused. She's acting like someone who knows exactly where she is and exactly what she's doing. Maybe you should just look at her ID before this goes any further." But Derek was too deep into his position to back down now, too invested in proving that he was right about who belonged in this space and who didn't. His pride had taken over completely, turning what could have been a simple misunderstanding into a confrontation that was about to reveal truths that would change everything for everyone involved. The rain continued to fall like bullets from heaven, each drop carrying the weight of assumptions and prejudices that were about to collide with reality in the most expensive way possible. Adrian held the phone to her ear as it rang, her dark eyes never leaving Derek's face while the storm continued to rage around them. The rain was coming down so hard now that visibility was reduced to maybe 30 yards, creating an intimate bubble of confrontation where the only things that mattered were the words about to be spoken and the consequences that would follow them. Derek stood with his arms crossed, still wearing that smug expression of a man who was absolutely certain that he was about to watch someone make a complete fool of themselves. He had seen this tactic before, desperate people pretending to call important contacts when they got caught somewhere they didn't belong, putting on elaborate performances to try to talk their way out of trouble. "Jonathan," Adrienne said when the call connected, her voice carrying clearly despite the noise of the storm. "Yes, it's Adrienne. Adrienne Maxwell." Derek rolled his eyes, dramatically turning toward Tyler with the expression of someone watching a particularly bad community theater performance. "Oh, nice touch," he muttered sarcastically. "It's Adrian, like they're old friends. I wonder what cleaning service is going to pretend they know her." But something about the way Adrian was standing, the complete confidence in her posture, the fact that she seemed utterly unintimidated by his uniform and authority, was beginning to plant seeds of doubt in the back of Derek's mind, seeds that he was desperately trying to ignore because acknowledging them would mean admitting that he might have made a catastrophic error in judgment. "I'm at Teterboro," Adrian continued, her voice steady and clear, "standing in the rain next to N924AM. I'm being physically blocked from boarding my aircraft by the pilot you assigned to this flight, a Captain Derek Harrison." The words hit Derek like a physical blow, each syllable carrying implications that his brain was still trying to reject. N924AM was indeed the tail number of the aircraft behind him. The fact that she knew it could be a coincidence, or she could have seen it painted on the fuselage, but something about the casual way she mentioned it, like someone stating their own address, made his stomach start to twist with the first whispers of real fear. Tyler was now staring at Derek with open alarm, recognizing that the situation was spiraling far beyond anything they had encountered in their months of flying together. Maya had come down from the cabin and was standing just close enough to hear the conversation, her face pale with the growing realization of what might be happening. "Yes," Adrian said into the phone, listening to someone on the other end while keeping her gaze locked on Derek's increasingly nervous face. "He thinks I'm maintenance staff. He's threatening to have me arrested for trespassing." There was a pause, and Derek could swear he heard shouting coming from the phone, even over the noise of the storm. Not just talking, not just conversation, but the kind of loud, angry shouting that suggested someone was absolutely furious about what they were being told. "Would you like to speak to him?" Adrian asked, pulling the phone away from her ear and holding it out toward Derek. "Jonathan Pierce would like to have a word with you." Derek stared at the phone like it was a venomous snake. Jonathan Pierce was the CEO of Elite Aviation Management, the company that employed Derek, the man who signed his paychecks and controlled his career. If this woman actually had Jonathan Pierce on the phone, if she actually knew him well enough to call him directly, then everything Derek thought he understood about this situation was catastrophically wrong. I'm not talking to your boyfriend, Derek said, but his voice had lost its earlier confidence. The bravado was still there, but it was hollow now. Desperate, the sound of a man trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he was still in control of the situation. He reached out not to take the phone but to push Adrian's hand away, a dismissive gesture that was meant to end the conversation and reassert his authority. It was a light touch, barely contact at all, but it crossed the line from verbal confrontation to physical action, and that crossing changed everything. "Do not touch me," Adrienne commanded, her voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that could stop a surgeon mid-procedure or freeze an entire operating room in the middle of a crisis. It was a voice that brooked no argument, accepted no challenge, and demanded immediate compliance from anyone who heard it. Derek actually flinched, surprised by the power in her tone and the way it seemed to cut through his assumptions and reach something deeper than his conscious mind. For just a moment, the mask of superiority slipped, and he looked like what he really was, a man who was in way over his head and beginning to realize it. "You have 3 seconds to take this phone," Adrian continued, her voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. "Or I will ensure that you never fly anything larger than a paper airplane again." The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that it carried more weight than any amount of shouting or dramatics could have managed. Derek found himself staring at the phone in her outstretched hand, his mind racing through possibilities and implications that he didn't want to consider. "You're bluffing," he said, but the words came out weak and uncertain, more question than statement. Derek Tyler pleaded, stepping closer to his captain. "Just take the phone. Please. This has gone far enough." One Adrienne counted, her voice steady as a metronome. Derek's hands were starting to shake slightly, though whether from cold fear or adrenaline was impossible to tell. Around them, the crowd of witnesses had grown larger, and more interested ground crew and passengers alike, drawn by the drama unfolding on the tarmac. "2," Adrian said, and Derek could swear the shouting from the phone was getting louder, as if someone on the other end was losing patience with the delay. Derek snatched the phone from her hand with a jerky, desperate motion, like someone grabbing a lifeline while falling off a cliff. He held it to his ear with trembling fingers, his face already pale with the growing understanding that he had just made the biggest mistake of his professional life. "This is Captain Harrison," he said into the phone, trying to inject some authority into his voice but failing miserably. "Who is this?" The voice that came through the phone was not a boyfriend. It was not a maintenance supervisor. It was not anyone from a cleaning company. It was Jonathan Pierce, and he was screaming so loudly that Derek had to pull the phone away from his ear, his face going completely white as the reality of his situation hit him like a sledgehammer to the chest. Every witness on the tarmac could hear the shouting, could see Derek's reaction, could watch in real time as a man's career and assumptions collapsed around him like a house built on sand in a hurricane. The storm outside had nothing on the tempest that was about to engulf Derek Harrison's carefully ordered world. "Harrison, are you completely out of your mind?" Jonathan Pierce's voice exploded from the phone so loudly that everyone within 20 feet could hear every word, even over the roar of the storm. Derek held the device away from his ear as if it might bite him, his face cycling through shades of pale that shouldn't have been possible on a living human being. The CEO's fury was legendary in aviation circles, but this was something beyond his usual corporate anger. This was the sound of a man watching his company's reputation being destroyed in real time by an employee who had managed to commit what might be the most expensive customer service failure in the history of private aviation. "You have Dr. Adrian Maxwell standing in the rain," Pierce continued, his voice carrying the kind of cold rage that was more terrifying than any amount of shouting. "She owns that aircraft, Harrison. She bought it last month for $65 million. She pays your salary, she pays my salary, and you just treated her like she was trying to steal hubcaps." Derek's knees actually buckled slightly as the full magnitude of his mistake crashed over him like a tsunami of professional destruction. Dr. Adrienne Maxwell wasn't just wealthy, she was billionaire-level rich, the kind of client that aviation management companies fought wars to acquire and retain. She was also black brilliant and standing in front of him soaked to the skin because he had decided that her appearance didn't match his narrow definition of what success should look like. "Mr. Pierce, She didn't look. Derek stammered, his earlier confidence collapsing like a controlled demolition. She was wearing casual clothes. She didn't present proper identification, I thought. You thought she was what Harrison Pierce's voice had dropped to a whisper that was somehow more menacing than his earlier shouting. You thought she was the help because she's black. Is that what you're telling me right now? No, sir. Absolutely not. I would never... Derek's protestations sounded weak and desperate even to his own ears. The truth was obvious to everyone listening, written in the assumptions he'd made and the words he'd chosen, and no amount of backtracking could erase the damage he'd done. Put her back on the phone, Pierce commanded. Now. Derek's hand trembled as he offered the phone back to Adrienne, looking like a man who had just been handed his own death sentence. She took the device with the same calm precision she'd shown throughout the entire confrontation, as if being vindicated by the CEO of a major aviation company was just another routine part of her day. Tyler Chen stood frozen in place, watching his captain's career implode while trying to process his own role in what had just happened. He'd known something was wrong, had tried to suggest checking identification or looking at the manifest, but he hadn't pushed hard enough or spoken up loud enough to prevent this disaster. Maya Rodriguez felt sick to her stomach as she watched the scene unfold, thinking about all the times she'd witnessed Derek make assumptions about passengers based on their appearance and hadn't found the courage to speak up. Her silence had been complicity, and now everyone was going to pay the price for Derek's prejudice and her cowardice. I'm here, Jonathan Adrienne said into the phone, her voice carrying the same controlled calm she'd maintained throughout the entire ordeal. She listened for a moment, her expression unreadable while Derek waited for the verdict that would determine his professional future. No, Jonathan, don't fire him yet, Adrienne said, and Derek felt a moment of desperate hope that maybe somehow he might survive this catastrophic error. She was being merciful, giving him a second chance, recognizing that everyone made mistakes. But then she continued speaking, and Derek realized that mercy was not what she had in mind. I want him to fly me to Aspen. Adrienne said, her eyes locked on Derek's terrified face. I want him to spend the next 4 hours thinking about exactly who is sitting in the back of his aircraft. We can discuss his employment status after we land. She hung up the phone and slipped it back into her pocket with the same casual motion someone might use to put away their keys after unlocking a door. The simple gesture somehow managed to convey absolute power and complete control over the situation. Get out of my way, Captain Adrienne said softly, and Derek scrambled aside so quickly he nearly tripped over the stairs. The man who had been blocking her path with physical intimidation just minutes earlier was now practically falling over himself to clear a route to the cabin. Dr. Maxwell. I am so terribly sorry, Derek babbled as she walked past him, his voice high and desperate. I had no idea who you were. I was just trying to protect the aircraft's security. Please understand I was following what I thought were proper protocols. Adrienne didn't even acknowledge his apologies. She climbed the stairs with the dignity of someone who had never doubted her right to be there, leaving Derek standing in the rain with the full weight of his assumptions and their consequences crushing down on him like the storm clouds overhead. The cabin of the G700 was everything Derek had described, and more, a masterpiece of luxury and engineering that represented the absolute pinnacle of private aviation. Cream leather seats that looked more like throne chairs, mahogany trim that probably cost more than most people's cars, technology that belonged in science fiction, and an atmosphere of quiet elegance that spoke of wealth so vast it didn't need to announce itself. Maya appeared at Adrienne's side, almost immediately, her hands shaking as she offered hot towels and apologies in equal measure. "Dr. Maxwell, I am so incredibly sorry about what just happened," she said, her voice thick with genuine remorse. "I should have spoken up, should have done something to stop him." Adrienne accepted the towel with grace, wiping rainwater from her face and hair while studying the young woman in front of her. Maya's distress was clearly genuine, her regret obvious, but Adrienne had learned long ago that good intentions without action were just another form of complicity. "How long have you been flying with Captain Harrison?" Adrienne asked, settling into one of the leather seats while Maya hovered nearby, desperate to somehow make amends for her silence. 8 months, Maya replied quietly. "And in those 8 months, I've seen him treat passengers differently based on how they looked, heard him make comments that made me uncomfortable, watched him assume things about people that weren't true. But you never said anything," Adrienne observed without accusation, simply stating a fact that they both understood. "I have 2 kids to feed," Maya said, her voice breaking slightly. "Jobs like this don't come along very often for people like me, people without connections or trust funds. I told myself that speaking up would just cost me my job without actually changing anything." Adrienne nodded with understanding rather than judgment. She knew what it was like to be the only one in rooms full of power, knew how hard it was to speak truth when your livelihood depended on the goodwill of people who might not want to hear it. The flight industry, like medicine, was still largely controlled by people who looked like Derek Harrison, and challenging that power structure required a level of security that most people simply didn't have. In the cockpit, Derek was strapping himself into the pilot's seat with the mechanical movements of a man in deep shock. His hands wouldn't stop shaking as he ran through the pre-flight checklist. His mind split between the technical requirements of safely operating the aircraft and the growing realization that his career was probably over regardless of how well he flew this particular trip. Tyler took his position in the co-pilot seat, his own thoughts churning with guilt and self-recrimination. He'd known something was wrong, had tried to warn Derek, but hadn't been forceful enough in his objections. Now they were all trapped in an aircraft together for the next 4 hours, flying toward Aspen, and whatever consequences awaited them there. As the engines spooled up and the G700 began its taxi toward the runway, Derek found himself facing the most important flight of his career, piloting a $65 million aircraft owned by the woman he'd just humiliated on the tarmac, knowing that every decision he made for the next 4 hours would be scrutinized and judged by someone who had every reason to want him gone. The irony was crushing. He was finally flying for the kind of passenger he'd always claimed to respect, someone with enough wealth and power to buy and sell his entire world, and he'd managed to insult and degrade her before she'd even set foot on the aircraft. As they lifted off into the storm-darkened sky, Derek Harrison began to understand that some mistakes couldn't be fixed with apologies, and some assumptions carried consequences that would follow him for the rest of his life. 30,000 feet above the storm that had battered Teterboro, the cabin of the G700 hummed with the kind of quiet tension that preceded either forgiveness or total destruction. Adrienne had removed her soggy sweatshirt and was now wrapped in a cashmere blanket that Maya had provided her laptop open as she conducted what appeared to be routine work but was actually a comprehensive investigation into the background of Captain Derek Harrison. The aircraft was performing beautifully, its advanced engines cutting through the night sky with the kind of smooth power that $65 million was supposed to buy. Derek was flying with textbook precision, every adjustment calculated to provide the smoothest possible ride, every radio call delivered with professional crispness, as if perfect piloting technique could somehow undo the damage he'd inflicted on the ground. But Adrienne wasn't interested in his flying skills. She was interested in patterns in the history that had led to their confrontation on the tarmac, in the deeper truths that people revealed when they thought nobody important was watching. Her laptop screen showed Derek's employment record, his financial history, his personal background, and what she was discovering painted a picture that was both more complex and more damning than she'd expected. Derek Harrison was drowning in debt. Medical bills for his daughter's cancer treatment stretched back 3 years, creating a paper trail of desperation that explained some of his behavior but excused none of it. Experimental treatments, cutting-edge therapies, medications that insurance companies refused to cover the financial pressure was enormous, but it was also self-inflicted through choices that went far beyond medical necessity. The real revelation came when she cross-referenced his flight logs with patterns of unusual cargo manifest discrepancies. Derek had been flying routes that made no sense from a passenger transportation perspective, carrying loads that were listed as personal effects, but weighed far more than clothing and toiletries should weigh. The timing of these flights corresponded perfectly with gaps in his daughter's treatment schedule, suggesting that Derek's medical crisis had driven him into something far more dangerous than just customer service failures. Maya appeared at her side with fresh coffee and the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing you were witnessing something that would change everything for everyone involved. "Dr. Maxwell is there. Anything else I can get you?" "Anything at all?" "Actually, yes," Adrian said, closing her laptop and looking directly at Maya. "I need you to show me the cargo manifest for this flight, and then I need you to walk me through the aircraft and point out anything that looks unusual or out of place." Maya's face went pale. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I am authorized to own this aircraft," Adrian said quietly. "Everything on it, every compartment, every storage area, every piece of equipment. I'm not asking for authorization. I'm giving you a direct order from the owner." They started in the main cabin, which looked exactly as it should, luxury seating, entertainment systems, the kind of amenities that justified the enormous expense of private aviation. But as they moved toward the rear of the aircraft, toward the private stateroom that Adrian had specifically requested when she'd ordered the plane, Maya's nervousness increased dramatically. "The bedroom suite is back here," Maya said, her voice tight with anxiety. "Captain Harrison asked me not to disturb anything in this area, said it was being used for special storage during the transition to new ownership." The bedroom was stunning, with a queen-sized bed, mahogany paneling, and an ensuite bathroom that belonged in a 5-star hotel rather than an aircraft. But Adrian's trained eye immediately noticed the discrepancy scuff marks on the hardwood floor that suggested heavy objects had been moved recently, a storage cabinet that wasn't quite closed properly, the faint smell of packing materials that shouldn't have been necessary for a routine passenger flight. She opened the storage cabinet that Maya had mentioned, and what she found inside made her breath catch in her throat. 3 black, hard-shell cases, the kind used for expensive camera equipment or delicate instruments, were shoved deep into the back of the compartment behind a row of decorative pillows. The cases were locked, but the locks weren't engaged. Whoever had put them there had been in a hurry. Adrian pulled out the first case and opened it, revealing a collection of luxury watches that represented more money than most people saw in a lifetime. Patek Philippe Richard Mille Rolex. Daytona models that she recognized from auction catalogs, pieces that belonged in bank vaults rather than aircraft storage compartments. Each watch was nestled in custom foam padding, protected and organized like inventory in a high-end jewelry store. "My God," Maya whispered, staring at the contents of the case. "Those are worth millions." Adrian finished pulling out her phone to photograph the contents before carefully replacing everything exactly as she'd found it. "And they're not declared on any cargo manifest, which means Captain Harrison is using my aircraft to smuggle goods across international borders." The second case contained more watches, different brands but equally valuable, while the third held what appeared to be rare coins and small pieces of artwork that had probably been stolen from private collections or museums. The total value of the cargo was staggering, representing the kind of criminal operation that involved organized networks and federal charges that could send people to prison for decades. Maya sank into one of the bedroom chairs, her face white with shock and the growing realization of how deep Derek's troubles actually went. I had no idea, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I mean, I knew he'd been acting strange, taking phone calls he didn't want anyone to hear, being secretive about cargo loading, but I never imagined. This explains everything, Adrienne said, her mind already working through the implications and the decisions she would need to make. His defensiveness on the tarmac, his assumption that I couldn't possibly be the owner, his desperate need to control access to the aircraft. He wasn't just being racist, though he was definitely that. He was protecting a criminal operation. The aircraft hit a patch of turbulence, reminding them both that they were still at 30,000 feet with Derek Harrison in control of their safety. Adrienne carefully closed the cases and returned them to their hiding place, her movements precise and methodical as she documented everything for the authorities who would need to be contacted the moment they landed. "What are we going to do?" Maya asked, her voice shaking with the weight of their discovery. "If he's involved with criminals, if there are people who are expecting him to deliver this cargo, we're going to let him fly us to Aspen," Adrienne said calmly. "And then we're going to let the FBI sort out how deep this operation goes and who else is involved. But first, I need to make sure Derek understands that his situation just went from embarrassing to catastrophic." She walked toward the front of the cabin, leaving Maya to process what they'd discovered while she prepared for a conversation that would determine whether Derek Harrison spent the next phase of his life trying to rebuild his career or trying to avoid federal prison. The cases of stolen goods weren't just evidence of criminal activity, they were proof that Derek's prejudices had blinded him to the most basic requirements of operational security. He'd been so focused on keeping what he thought was a maintenance worker away from his illegal cargo that he'd never considered the possibility that the actual aircraft owner might decide to explore every inch of her new purchase. His assumptions about who mattered and who could be dismissed had led him to make tactical errors that would destroy not just his own life, but potentially the lives of everyone connected to his smuggling operation. As Adrienne prepared to confront Derek with the evidence of his crimes, she reflected on the complex web of cause and effect that had brought them to this moment. His daughter's illness had created financial pressure, his racism had created operational blindness, and his criminal choices had created consequences that would ripple far beyond anything he'd imagined when he'd first decided to use her aircraft for illegal purposes. The storm they'd left behind in New Jersey was nothing compared to the tempest that Derek Harrison was about to face, and unlike the weather, this was a storm entirely of his own making. Adrienne walked toward the cockpit with the measured pace of someone who had spent years delivering life-changing diagnoses to patients and their families. The evidence of Derek's criminal activity was secured in her phone, documented with the kind of thorough precision that would satisfy federal prosecutors. But more importantly, she now understood the full scope of what she was dealing with in the man who was currently piloting her aircraft. She stopped at the cockpit door and knocked with the authority of someone who owned every inch of the aluminum and steel around them. "Captain Harrison, I need to speak with you." Derek's voice came through the intercom tight with the strain of trying to maintain professional composure while knowing that his career was hanging by a thread. "Dr. Maxwell, we're at a critical phase of flight. Perhaps when we reach cruising altitude, we're at 38,000 feet, Captain Adrienne interrupted. "Tyler can maintain straight and level flight while we have a conversation. I need you in the cabin now." The cockpit door opened after a moment of hesitation, and Derek emerged looking like a man who had aged 10 years in the past 2 hours. His perfect uniform was wrinkled, his silver hair disheveled, and his hands had a slight tremor that spoke of stress levels that were approaching dangerous territory. Tyler remained at the controls, but Adrienne could see him watching the interaction through the reflection in the windscreen. "Dr. Maxwell, I want to apologize again for my behavior on the ground." Derek began launching into what sounded like a rehearsed speech. "I realize now that I made assumptions that were completely inappropriate. I let my concern for security protocols override my professional judgment, and I take full responsibility for Derek, Adrian said, cutting him off with the kind of voice that could stop a surgical procedure mid-incision. I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to say, because your response is going to determine whether you spend the next 20 years as a free man or as a federal prisoner. Derek's face went white, the blood draining from his cheeks so quickly that Adrian worried he might actually faint. Maya, who had positioned herself near the galley where she could hear the conversation, gripped the counter with both hands as she prepared for whatever revelation was coming. I found the cases, Derek Adrian said simply. 3 of them hidden in the bedroom storage compartment. Luxury watches, rare coins, artwork. I'd estimate the total value at somewhere around $12 million, none of which appears on any cargo manifest. Derek's legs actually buckled, and he had to grab the back of one of the passenger seats to keep from falling. The color that had drained from his face was replaced by a sickly green pallor that suggested he was fighting not to vomit right there in the cabin of the aircraft he'd been using to transport stolen goods. Dr. Maxwell. I can explain. He whispered, his voice so quiet that she had to strain to hear him over the noise of the engines. It's not what it looks like. I was forced into this. They have my daughter. No one has your daughter. Derek. Adrian said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had done her research. Emma is at Children's Hospital in Miami, receiving excellent care that's being paid for through a combination of insurance and the money you've been earning from this smuggling operation. Don't insult my intelligence by pretending you're some kind of victim. Derek's careful facade cracked completely, and for the first time since she'd met him, Adrian saw him as he really was, a desperate man who had made terrible choices and was now facing consequences he'd never imagined. The tears that started running down his face weren't calculated or manipulative. They were the raw emotion of someone whose world was collapsing in real time. She's going to die without those treatments, he said, his voice breaking. The insurance company calls them experimental. They won't cover anything that might actually save her life. I've spent every penny I had borrowed against everything I owned, and it still wasn't enough. So you decided to become a criminal, Adrian said without sympathy. You decided to use my aircraft, my fuel, my liability insurance, and my FAA registration to transport stolen goods. You put my company at risk, my reputation at risk, and the safety of everyone on this aircraft at risk, all so you could avoid having honest conversations with your insurance company and your daughter's medical team. Derek looked at her with the desperation of a drowning man reaching for a life preserver that was just out of reach. Please, Dr. Maxwell. I know what I did was wrong, but if I go to prison, Emma won't have anyone to fight for her care. My wife doesn't understand the medical system, doesn't know how to advocate for the treatments Emma needs. Your daughter needs a father who isn't a criminal, Adrian replied. She needs a parent who teaches her that there are lines you don't cross no matter how desperate you become. What you've been doing isn't love, Derek. It's selfishness disguised as sacrifice. Tyler's voice crackled through the intercom. We're beginning our descent into Aspen. I need the captain back in the cockpit for the approach. Derek looked toward the cockpit, then back at Adrian, his face cycling through expressions of panic desperation and calculation. For a moment she could see him weighing his options, considering whether there was any way to salvage his situation, or whether he was completely trapped by the choices he'd made. I need you to fly this aircraft safely to Aspen, Adrian said, reading his thoughts. I need you to land us without incident, and then I need you to cooperate fully with the federal agents who will be waiting for us on the ground. If you do those things, I'll make sure your daughter's medical team knows about your situation and that appropriate resources are made available for her continued care. And if I don't, Derek asked, though they both knew he didn't really have a choice. Then your daughter loses her father to federal prison, and she loses her medical advocate to criminal stupidity, Adrian said. The choice is yours, Captain. Derek straightened his shoulders with what might have been the last remnant of his professional dignity. I'll get us to Aspen safely, he said quietly. and then I'll accept whatever consequences come after that." As he walked back toward the cockpit, Adrian felt a complex mixture of emotions that she hadn't expected. Anger at his racism and criminal behavior, certainly, but also a grudging respect for his willingness to face the consequences of his actions. Derek Harrison was a flawed man who had made terrible choices, but in the end he was choosing to prioritize the safety of his passengers over his own desperate situation. Maya approached cautiously, her eyes red from crying as she processed everything she'd heard. "What's going to happen to all of us?" she asked. "That depends," Adrian said, looking out the window at the mountain peaks that were beginning to appear in the distance. "It depends on who else knew about Derek's activities, who helped him, who looked the other way, and who was brave enough to speak up when speaking up mattered." The aircraft began its descent toward one of the most challenging airports in North America, piloted by a man whose life was about to change forever, carrying cargo that would send him to prison and passengers who would never forget the night when assumptions and reality collided at 38,000 feet. The approach into Aspen-Pitkin County Airport was always dangerous, even under perfect conditions with experienced crews and functioning aircraft. At nearly 8,000 feet elevation, surrounded by peaks that rose to 14,000 feet, the airport required pilots to thread their aircraft through mountain valleys using precise navigation and split-second timing that left no room for error or hesitation. Tonight, none of those ideal conditions existed. Derek Harrison sat in the captain's seat with his entire world crashing down around him, trying to focus on the complex approach procedures while his mind reeled with the knowledge that FBI agents would be waiting for him on the ground. His hands, which had been trembling slightly throughout the flight, now shook visibly as he adjusted throttles and flight controls. Tyler Chen monitored the instruments with growing concern, watching his captain's deteriorating emotional state while trying to maintain his own focus on the challenging approach ahead. The weather at Aspen was marginal low clouds, gusty winds, visibility that was right at minimums, and Tyler was beginning to wonder if Derek was mentally capable of safely completing the landing. Flaps to approach setting. Derek called out, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to maintain the professional cadence that had served him throughout 15 years of flying. The aircraft responded smoothly, but Tyler could see Derek's hands shaking on the controls, could hear the stress in his voice, could sense that his captain was operating right at the edge of his psychological limits. In the cabin, Adrian sat strapped into her seat with her laptop secured and her phone ready to call the authorities the moment they were safely on the ground. Maya had taken her position in the flight attendant's jump seat, her face pale with anxiety about the landing and everything that would follow it. The luxury appointments of the G700 seemed surreal, given the criminal cargo hidden just a few feet away, and the emotionally shattered pilot trying to navigate them through one of the most dangerous approaches in North America. Aspen Tower Gulfstream N924AM 10 miles north for the localizer approach. Derek transmitted his voice steady enough for air traffic control but hollow with despair to anyone who knew what he was going through. N924. AM Aspen Tower cleared for the localizer runway, 15. Approach wind 180 at 15, gusting 25, altimeter 30.15. Report the outer marker. Tyler cross-checked the approach plate, confirming their altitude and course, while keeping one eye on Derek's increasingly erratic control inputs. The captain was over-controlling, making corrections that were too large and too frequent, flying like someone whose mind was somewhere else entirely. Derek Tyler said quietly, his voice not transmitting on the radio. "You need to focus. This approach doesn't forgive mistakes, and we've got passengers depending on us to get this right." Derek nodded, but didn't respond verbally, his entire attention seemingly focused on the glowing instruments in front of him. But Tyler could see the sweat beading on his captain's forehead despite the cool temperature in the cockpit. Could see the tension in Derek's shoulders and the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid. They passed the outer marker at exactly the prescribed altitude and airspeed, But Derek's control of the aircraft was becoming more erratic with each mile they flew toward the airport. The G700 wandered left and right of the center line, pitched up and down as Derek chased the glide slope, responded to control inputs that seemed driven more by panic than by professional technique. Stable approach criteria, Tyler warned, using the formal language that pilots employed when an approach was becoming dangerous. We're outside acceptable parameters for airspeed and course deviation. But Derek seemed not to hear him, his entire world reduced to the instruments in front of him and the crushing weight of knowledge that his career, his freedom, and his daughter's future were all ending simultaneously. The approach continued to deteriorate, the aircraft's flight path becoming increasingly unstable as Derek struggled with control inputs that should have been automatic after 15 years of professional flying. Derek execute the missed approach, Tyler commanded, his voice sharp with alarm as they descended through clouds toward terrain that would kill them all if they continued on their current trajectory. We're not stable. We're not configured properly, and we need to go around. Derek's response was to push the nose down further, as if he could force the aircraft to comply with his will through sheer desperation. The G700 accelerated beyond approach speed, the wings fighting for lift in the thin mountain air while warning systems began chiming their electronic alerts throughout the cockpit. Pull up terrain, pull up, the synthetic voice of the ground proximity warning system announced with mechanical urgency. Pull up terrain. Tyler made a decision that would save all their lives. Without requesting or receiving permission from his captain, he pushed the throttles to full power and pulled back on his set of flight controls, executing a missed approach that Derek should have initiated 30 seconds earlier. The powerful engines responded immediately, lifting the aircraft away from the mountainous terrain that had been reaching up toward them like stone fingers in the darkness. "What are you doing?" Derek shouted, his voice high and panicked, as the aircraft climbed away from the airport. "We need to land. We need to get this over with. I can't keep flying around, knowing what's waiting for me." "You can't land an aircraft in your current mental state," Tyler replied firmly, taking primary control of the flight. "I'm declaring an emergency and requesting vectors for another approach. You need to pull yourself together or let me handle the landing." In the cabin, Adrienne felt the sudden acceleration and climb, understanding immediately that something had gone wrong with their approach. Maya looked terrified, gripping her seat restraints as the aircraft maneuvered sharply through the mountain air. But Adrienne's experience in high-stress medical situations helped her remain calm, even as she realized that Derek's emotional breakdown was threatening their physical safety. Aspen Tower, N, 9:24 a.m. Executing missed approach request. Vectors for another attempt. Tyler transmitted his voice professional despite the chaos in the cockpit beside him. N, 9:24 a.m. Roger, missed approach. Climb and maintain 12,000, turn left. Heading 270, advise when ready for vectors to final approach course. Derek slumped in his seat, his hands falling away from the controls as the full reality of his situation overwhelmed his ability to function. The man who had blocked Adrienne from boarding her own aircraft just hours earlier now sat defeated and broken, unable to perform the basic job functions that had defined his identity for most of his adult life. "I can't do this anymore," Derek whispered, his voice barely audible over the noise of the engines. "I can't pretend I'm in control when everything is falling apart. My daughter is dying. My career is over. And I'm going to prison. What's the point of landing safely when there's nothing left to live for?" Tyler looked at his captain with a mixture of sympathy and alarm, recognizing that Derek was experiencing the kind of psychological breakdown that could endanger everyone on board. In the space of a single day, Derek had gone from respected professional to exposed criminal to emotionally shattered man contemplating the ruins of his life. "The point," Tyler said firmly, "is that your daughter needs you to be brave enough to face the consequences of your choices. The point is that Dr. Maxwell and Maya don't deserve to die because you made bad decisions. The point is that being a pilot means protecting your passengers even when your own world is collapsing." Adrienne unbuckled her seatbelt and walked forward to the cockpit, understanding that Derek's emotional state was creating a safety risk that needed to be addressed immediately. Maya tried to stop her, worried about the danger of moving around the cabin during an emergency approach, but Adrienne had dealt with enough crises to know when direct intervention was necessary. "Derek," she said, standing in the cockpit doorway with the calm authority that had served her through countless medical emergencies. "I need you to listen to me very carefully. Your daughter needs medical care, and that care requires money. If you get us safely on the ground, I will personally ensure that Emma receives the best possible treatment regardless of what happens to you legally." Derek looked up at her with eyes that were red with tears and exhaustion, seeing for the first time not just the woman he had wronged, but someone who might actually have the power to help his child even after he was gone. "If you don't get us safely on the ground," Adrienne continued, "Emma loses her father to stupidity rather than to justice, and she loses any chance of having someone with resources advocate for her medical needs. The choice is yours, Captain, but choose quickly because we're running out of fuel and altitude." Derek straightened in his seat, wiping his eyes with the back of his uniform sleeve and reaching for the flight controls with hands that were still shaking but no longer paralyzed by despair. "Tyler, I need you to monitor my performance," he said quietly. "If I can't handle the approach safely, you take control immediately." "Copy that." Captain Tyler replied, relief evident in his voice as Derek began to engage with the task of flying the aircraft instead of simply surrendering to his circumstances. The second approach was textbook perfect, executed with the precision and professionalism that had made Derek a successful pilot before criminal desperation had corrupted his judgment. The G700 touched down smoothly on Aspen's challenging runway, rolling to a stop, with the gentle precision that $65 million of aircraft engineering was designed to provide. As the engines wound down and the aircraft came to rest on the tarmac, Derek knew that he had just completed his final landing as a professional pilot, but at least it had been a good one. The flashing red and blue lights of law enforcement vehicles painted the Aspen tarmac in dramatic colors as the G700 came to rest at the private aviation terminal. FBI agents, local police, DEA officers, and aviation security personnel had been waiting for over an hour after Adrienne's encrypted message had alerted federal authorities to the situation unfolding at 40,000 feet above the Colorado Rockies. Derek Harrison sat in the captain's seat for a long moment after shutting down the engines, his hands resting motionless on the controls that had defined his professional identity for 15 years. The aircraft was silent except for the ticking sounds of cooling metal and the distant voices of law enforcement officers positioning themselves around the jet. "It's time," Tyler said quietly, unbuckling his restraints but making no move to leave his seat. In the space of a few hours, he had gone from co-pilot to acting captain, from subordinate to witness, from colleague to potential accomplice, depending on what the investigation revealed about his knowledge of Derek's activities. Through the cockpit windscreen, Derek could see at least a dozen federal agents and local officers, some carrying assault rifles, others with handcuffs and documentation, all of them focused on the aircraft that had just delivered evidence of a smuggling operation that apparently extended far beyond anything he had imagined when he first agreed to carry special cargo to pay for his daughter's medical treatments. In the cabin, Adrienne was already organizing her documentation, preparing to turn over the evidence she had gathered, along with a complete account of Derek's behavior from the moment they had met on the tarmac at Teterboro. Maya sat in her jump seat, looking terrified, understanding that her career in aviation was probably over regardless of her level of involvement in Derek's criminal activities. The main cabin door opened with a hydraulic hiss, and Agent Sarah Martinez of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division stepped into the aircraft, followed by 3 other federal officers and 2 members of the local police department. Martinez was a 20-year veteran of complex financial investigations, someone who had seen enough corruption and desperation to understand the human elements behind criminal activity without letting sympathy interfere with justice. "Ladies and gentlemen, Agent Martinez announced in the formal tone that marked the beginning of official proceedings. "I need everyone to remain in their seats while we secure the aircraft and process the scene. Dr. Maxwell, I understand you're the one who contacted our Denver office during the flight." "That's correct," Adrienne replied, standing slowly and keeping her hands visible as the armed officers assessed the situation. "I discovered evidence of smuggling activity and documented it with photographs and video. I also have extensive documentation of Captain Harrison's behavior and statements throughout the flight." Derek stood up from the pilot's seat with the slow movements of someone who understood that his freedom would be measured in minutes rather than years. He walked into the main cabin area where the federal agents were waiting, his hands raised slightly in a gesture of surrender that acknowledged his situation without requiring verbal confession. "Captain Derek Harrison," Agent Martinez said, consulting a tablet computer that contained information about the investigation that had been building for months. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit smuggling, transportation of stolen property, money laundering, and about 6 other federal charges that we'll discuss in detail after you've been read your rights." The handcuffs clicking around Derek's wrists sounded like the closing of a book, the final punctuation mark on a career that had started with dreams of flying and ended with federal prison sentences. He didn't resist or protest, simply stood quietly as Agent Martinez recited the Miranda warning that formally marked his transition from professional pilot to federal defendant. Tyler emerged from the cockpit looking shell-shocked, his young face pale with the realization that his aviation career might be ending before it had really begun. "Agent Martinez, I want to be completely clear that I had no knowledge of any illegal activity. I suspected something was wrong with Captain Harrison's behavior, but I never saw any evidence of criminal cargo or smuggling operations." "We'll be interviewing everyone separately," Martinez replied professionally. "Right now, I need you to step off the aircraft while we process the crime scene and secure the evidence that Dr. Maxwell discovered." Maya was crying quietly as she gathered her personal belongings, understanding that her silence about Derek's discriminatory behavior had made her complicit in a system that enabled both racism and criminal activity. "I should have spoken up," she said to Adrian as they prepared to leave the aircraft. "I knew something was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job. Fear makes people do things they regret later," Adrian replied with more compassion than judgment. "What matters now is that you tell the truth about what you observed and help ensure that other people don't find themselves in similar situations." As Derek was led down the aircraft stairs toward a waiting federal vehicle, he looked back at the G700 one final time. The jet that had represented luxury and professional achievement now looked like evidence in a criminal case, its sleek lines and expensive appointments unable to disguise the fact that it had been used as a tool for federal crimes. "Doctor," Maxwell Derek said as the agents paused near the bottom of the stairs, "I want you to know that my behavior toward you today had nothing to do with the cargo or the criminal activity. That was just me being an ignorant fool who made assumptions based on prejudice. The smuggling was about desperation, but the racism was just stupidity." Adrienne looked down at him from the aircraft doorway, seeing not just the man who had blocked her from boarding her own plane, but also the father who had been driven to criminal activity by medical bills, and the employee who had been trapped by assumptions that blinded him to basic operational security. "Derek," she said, her voice carrying the measured tone she used for delivering difficult diagnoses, "your daughter needs you to be better than your worst decisions. She needs you to face the consequences of your choices with dignity and use whatever time you have left to teach her that integrity matters more than money." Agent Martinez interrupted their conversation by guiding Derek toward the federal vehicle where he would begin the process of cooperation that might reduce his eventual sentence. As the car drove away with Derek in the back seat, Tyler and Maya were led to separate vehicles for interviews that would determine their own futures in the aviation industry. Adrian remained on the aircraft with the federal investigators walking them through her discovery of the hidden cargo and providing them with the documentation she had compiled during the flight. The cases of stolen watches and artwork would become evidence in a much larger investigation that involved international smuggling networks and criminal organizations that used private aviation to move high-value goods without customs scrutiny. Dr. Maxwell Agent Martinez said as her team finished photographing and cataloging the evidence. I want you to understand that your aircraft will need to be impounded as evidence while we trace the full extent of this smuggling operation. The investigation could take several months, and there may be civil forfeiture issues depending on what we discover about the criminal use of the aircraft. I understand, Adrian replied, though the thought of losing her jet to federal bureaucracy was frustrating after everything she had been through. What I want to understand is how someone like Derek Harrison with financial problems and obvious psychological issues was able to pass background checks and maintain security clearances while using private aircraft for criminal purposes. That's exactly what we intend to find out, Martinez answered grimly. This case appears to be part of a much larger problem with security protocols in private aviation, and your experience today is going to help us address vulnerabilities that have been exploited by criminal organizations for years. As the federal agents continued their work, and Derek began his journey through the criminal justice system, Adrienne reflected on the complex chain of cause and effect that had brought them all to this moment. Derek's daughter's illness had created financial pressure. His racism had created operational blindness. His criminal choices had created federal charges, and his assumptions about who mattered had led him to underestimate the very person who would ultimately expose his entire operation. The storm that had battered Teterboro hours earlier seemed insignificant compared to the tempest of legal consequences that Derek Harrison would face in the months and years ahead, consequences that stemmed directly from his inability to see past his own prejudices long enough to recognize that the woman in the hoodie owned everything he thought he was protecting. 6 months after that stormy night at Teterboro Airport, the federal courthouse in Denver buzzed with media attention as Derek Harrison's sentencing hearing drew to a close. The man who had once commanded respect in aviation circles now sat at the defendant's table in an ill-fitting suit, his silver hair grayer and thinner, his face bearing the weight of choices that had cost him everything he'd thought mattered. The prosecution had laid out a devastating case that revealed Derek's smuggling operation as part of a much larger criminal network stretching from Europe to Asia, using private jets to move stolen artwork, luxury goods, and conflict diamonds worth over $200 million. Derek's cooperation with federal investigators had helped unravel the entire organization, but it hadn't erased the crimes he'd committed or the lives he'd affected through his actions. Judge Patricia Hernandez reviewed the sentencing guidelines with the methodical precision of someone who had seen too many promising lives destroyed by criminal choices. "Mr. Harrison," she said, looking directly at Derek across the courtroom, "you were trusted with the safety of passengers and crew, trusted with access to aircraft worth millions of dollars, trusted with security clearances that recognized your professional competence and personal integrity." Derek stood to receive his sentence, his lawyers flanking him while his wife and teenage daughter Emma sat in the front row of the gallery, both of them crying quietly as they prepared to hear how long he would be separated from their family. Emma looked healthier than she had in years, her cancer in remission, thanks to treatments that were now being funded through a victim assistance program that Dr. Adrienne Maxwell had personally established. "You betrayed every one of those trusts," Judge Hernandez continued, "not just through your criminal activity, but through behavior that revealed prejudices and assumptions that have no place in professional aviation or civilized society." Dr. Maxwell's victim impact statement made it clear that your actions on that tarmac were driven by bias that went far deeper than criminal desperation. Adrian sat in the second row of the courthouse gallery wearing a simple black suit and observing the proceedings with the same focused attention she brought to complex medical procedures. Beside her sat Tyler Chen, now the chief pilot for her expanding fleet of aircraft, and Maya Rodriguez, who had become head of cabin services after completing additional training and demonstrating genuine commitment to creating inclusive environments for all passengers. However, the judge continued, the court also recognizes that your cooperation with federal investigators prevented significant additional crimes and helped law enforcement dismantle a criminal organization that was using private aviation to facilitate international smuggling operations. Your testimony led to 17 additional arrests and the recovery of over $50 million in stolen property. Derek's wife reached for her daughter's hand as Judge Hernandez prepared to announce the sentence that would determine how much of Emma's remaining childhood her father would miss. The courtroom fell completely silent, everyone understanding that they were witnessing the moment when consequences became reality. Derek Harrison. I sentence you to 7 years in federal prison followed by 3 years of supervised release, Judge Hernandez announced. You are also ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $3.2 million to victims of the smuggling operation you participated in. The sentence was significantly less than what Derek had feared, but still devastating for a man who had never imagined spending any portion of his life behind bars. As federal marshals prepared to escort him from the courtroom, Derek turned to look at his family, then at Adrian, his eyes carrying a mixture of remorse and gratitude that was difficult to interpret. Your Honor, Derek said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. I would like to make a statement. Judge Hernandez nodded permission, and Derek turned to face the gallery where Adrienne sat with her team. Dr. Maxwell, what I did to you on that tarmac had nothing to do with criminal activity, and everything to do with ignorance and prejudice that I should have recognized and addressed years ago. My assumptions about who belonged in spaces of wealth and power were wrong, harmful, and inexcusable. He paused, gathering his thoughts while his daughter watched from the front row. You could have destroyed me completely that night, could have exposed me to maximum criminal liability and maximum public humiliation. Instead, you showed mercy while still ensuring justice, and you made sure my daughter received medical care even after I was arrested. That kind of grace is something I'll spend the rest of my life trying to understand and emulate. Adrienne stood as Derek finished speaking, her movement drawing the attention of everyone in the courtroom. Derek, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room, your daughter doesn't need you to understand grace. She needs you to demonstrate integrity, to use your time in prison to become someone worthy of her respect, and to emerge from this experience as someone who fights against the prejudices that led to your downfall. She needs you to teach other people that assumptions based on appearance can destroy careers and lives, that bias creates blindness that makes even smart people do stupid things, and that redemption is possible, but only through genuine accountability and change. Derek nodded, tears streaming down his face as federal marshals stepped forward to escort him from the courtroom. As he was led away in handcuffs, his family wept in the front row, while Adrienne reflected on the complex emotions that came with witnessing both justice and human tragedy playing out simultaneously. After the sentencing, Adrienne walked outside the courthouse where a small crowd of reporters waited for comments about a case that had become a symbol of both aviation security failures and the persistence of racial bias in professional settings. Tyler and Maya stood beside her, both of them having given their own statements about the need for better training and oversight in private aviation. Dr. Maxwell, one reporter called out, do you believe 7 years is sufficient punishment for Captain Harrison's crimes? I believe 7 years gives Derek Harrison enough time to understand the consequences of his choices while still allowing him to have a relationship with his daughter as she grows into adulthood, Adrienne replied. Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about creating conditions where people can learn from their mistakes and contribute positively to society. What changes do you think need to be made in private aviation to prevent similar incidents? Another reporter asked. The aviation industry needs to address both security vulnerabilities that allow criminal activity and cultural problems that allow prejudice to flourish, Adrienne said. We need better background investigations, better psychological evaluations, better training on unconscious bias, and better oversight of crew behavior with all passengers regardless of their appearance or apparent wealth. As the press conference ended and the media attention moved on to other stories, Adrienne reflected on the journey that had brought her from that rainy tarmac at Teterboro to this courthouse in Denver. Derek Harrison would spend the next 7 years learning whether he could transform his prejudices into wisdom, his criminal choices into advocacy for change, and his failures into lessons that might prevent other people from making similar mistakes. The price of those lessons had been enormous for everyone involved, but Adrienne hoped that the changes already beginning to ripple through the aviation industry would ensure that future passengers wouldn't have to fight for the basic dignity of being judged by their character rather than their appearance. 2 years after Derek Harrison began serving his federal prison sentence, Dr. Adrienne Maxwell stood at the podium of the National Association of Private Aviation Professionals, addressing an audience of pilots, flight attendants, ground crew, and aviation executives who had gathered in Las Vegas to discuss the industry changes that had emerged from what media outlets had dubbed the Teterboro incident. The convention center buzzed with the energy of an industry in transition where long-standing assumptions about passengers and crew were being challenged by new training programs, oversight requirements, and cultural shifts that prioritized inclusion and professional excellence over traditional hierarchies based on appearance and social connections. 3 years ago, Adrienne began her voice carrying clearly across the packed auditorium. I was denied boarding on my own aircraft by a pilot who made assumptions about my identity based on my clothing and my race. That confrontation led to discoveries about criminal activity, security failures, and cultural problems that had been ignored for too long in private aviation. The audience listened with rapt attention, many of them having experienced their own moments of unconscious bias or witnessed discrimination that they had failed to address. The aviation industry, like many professional fields, was slowly recognizing that diversity and inclusion weren't just moral imperatives but operational necessities that affected safety, security, and service quality. Today, I'm proud to announce the graduation of the first class from the Adrienne Maxwell Aviation Academy. She continued gesturing toward a group of young pilots sitting in the front rows. 24 pilots from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in aviation, trained to the highest professional standards and committed to creating an industry where competence matters more than connections. Among the graduates sat Marcus Williams, a young black man from Detroit who had grown up in the same neighborhood where Adrienne had attended medical school. His path to aviation had been supported by scholarships, mentorship, and training programs that hadn't existed when Derek Harrison was learning to fly 30 years earlier. Tyler Chin, now Director of Flight Operations for Maxwell Aviation, stood at the side of the stage, wearing the 4 stripes of a chief pilot, his career having flourished in an environment where speaking up about problems was rewarded rather than discouraged. The young man who had tried to warn Derek Harrison about his behavior toward Adrienne had become a leader in promoting professional standards and inclusive practices throughout the industry. Maya Rodriguez sat with other senior flight attendants who had become instructors in the new bias awareness training programs that were now mandatory for all private aviation crews. Her transformation from fearful silence to vocal advocacy had inspired other crew members to speak up about discriminatory behavior and safety concerns that had previously been ignored or dismissed. The changes we've implemented aren't just about preventing discrimination, Adrienne continued. They're about creating an industry where every passenger feels respected, every crew member feels empowered to speak up about problems, and every flight operates with the highest standards of safety and professionalism. In the audience, Jonathan Pierce, the CEO who had screamed at Derek Harrison over the phone that stormy night, nodded approvingly as Adrienne outlined the training programs and oversight mechanisms that his company had helped develop. The incident that had nearly destroyed his business had ultimately forced positive changes that made his operations more professional and more profitable. I want to share a letter I received last week, Adrian said, pulling out a folded piece of paper that had been carefully preserved since its arrival. It's from Derek Harrison, currently serving his federal sentence, but also studying to become a counselor who works with people struggling with addiction and financial desperation. The audience stirred with interest and some discomfort, many of them having followed Derek's story through media coverage and industry discussions. His case had become a cautionary tale about how personal problems could lead to criminal activity and how unconscious bias could create operational blindness that endangered everyone involved. Derek writes, Dr. Maxwell, I've spent 2 years thinking about the choices that brought me to prison and the assumptions that prevented me from seeing you as the aircraft owner rather than as someone who didn't belong in that space. The racism wasn't caused by my financial problems, it was revealed by them. The criminal activity was a choice, but the prejudice was a character flaw that I had carried for years without acknowledging or addressing. Adrian paused, letting Derek's words resonate with an audience of aviation professionals who understood how easily unconscious bias could influence split-second decisions in high-stress environments. The industry was slowly recognizing that diversity training wasn't political correctness, but operational necessity in a world where passengers came from all backgrounds, and crew competence couldn't be judged by appearance. He continues, My daughter Emma is now cancer-free thanks to medical care that you helped arrange even after my arrest. She wants to become a pilot when she grows up, and I hope that by the time she's ready for flight training, the industry will judge her by her skills rather than by her last name or her father's mistakes. I'm using my time in prison to study counseling techniques that I hope will help other people address their biases before those prejudices destroy their careers and hurt innocent people. Emma Harrison, now 16 and healthy, sat in the back of the auditorium with her mother, both of them having attended the convention to see the positive changes that had emerged from Derek's catastrophic errors. Emma wore a T-shirt from an aviation summer camp that had been funded by Adrian's foundation, her dreams of becoming a pilot supported by programs that hadn't existed when her father was learning to fly. Derek's story reminds us that transformation is possible, but only through genuine accountability and sustained effort, Adrian concluded. The aviation industry is changing because people like Tyler and Maya chose to speak up, because companies like Elite Aviation chose to implement new standards, and because passengers like all of you chose to demand better treatment for everyone who flies. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, reflecting an industry that was slowly but steadily addressing problems that had been ignored for too long. Private aviation was becoming more diverse, more inclusive, and more professional, with standards that prioritized competence over connections and service over stereotypes. After the convention, Adrian flew home to Baltimore in her replacement aircraft, a newer G700 that had been purchased after the original jet was finally released from federal evidence storage. Tyler served as captain, while Maya managed cabin service, both of them having earned their positions through merit and performance rather than connections or traditional expectations. As they cruised at 40,000 feet above the American heartland, Adrian reflected on the journey that had taken her from that confrontation on a rainy tarmac to this moment of industry leadership and positive change. Derek Harrison was serving his sentence and working toward redemption. His daughter was healthy and pursuing her own aviation dreams, and the entire private aviation industry was slowly becoming more welcoming to people who didn't fit traditional expectations of what success should look like. The storm that had battered Teterboro that night had been temporary, but the changes it had precipitated were lasting, creating a more professional and inclusive industry, where assumptions based on appearance were replaced by standards based on competence, character, and commitment to excellence. 5 years after his sentencing, Derek Harrison was released from federal prison as a changed man who had used his incarceration to earn certifications in addiction counseling and bias education. He now worked at a nonprofit organization that helped people facing financial crises find legal alternatives to criminal activity, speaking regularly at aviation conferences about the dangers of unconscious prejudice and the importance of addressing personal problems before they led to professional failures. His daughter Emma had earned her private pilot's license and was studying aerospace engineering at MIT, funded by a scholarship from the Adrian Maxwell Foundation that supported students whose parents had made mistakes but were committed to positive change. The Maxwell Aviation Academy had graduated over 200 pilots from diverse backgrounds, fundamentally changing the demographics and culture of private aviation while maintaining the highest standards of professional competence and safety. Tyler Chen had become one of the youngest chief pilots in the industry, while Maya Rodriguez had established training programs that were adopted by aviation companies worldwide, focusing on creating inclusive environments where all passengers felt respected and all crew members felt empowered to speak up about problems. On a bright morning in spring, Dr. Adrian Maxwell boarded her jet at Teterboro Airport for a flight to speak at a medical conference in Geneva, greeted at the aircraft stairs by Captain Jennifer Washington, a young black woman who had graduated from the Maxwell Academy 2 years earlier. As Adrian settled into her seat, she smiled at the sight of the professional crew who had judged her worthy of excellent service based on nothing more complicated than her reservation confirmation and her basic human dignity proof that an industry could change when enough people chose courage over comfort and inclusion over assumption.